Hey, have you ever been in a place in your life and thought, how did I get here? As in like, ever been somewhere sort of so cool or so amazing or so sort of restricted to think, how did kind of an ordinary person like me get here? Ever experienced that? About, it was 10 years ago or something like that. I was working for a charity that had a fundraising cycling event as part of what they did. And the governor of South Australia at that time was getting into cycling. And he heard about this and he decided he wanted to be part of the whole fundraising thing. And he wanted to put together a team of people, of key business people and stuff like this, and community leaders. He wanted to put a team together. So it's not hard to put a team together of people who want to ride a bike with the governor, right? I think there's a photo of the team we put together. Here's the team we put together. It's the governor in the middle, our CEO, and a bunch of other guys who are going to be in the team with him. And the governor decided that he wanted to host, he hadn't met all the people in his team, he wanted to host a meet and greet for his team at his house, at Government House. And so I kid you not, this is absolutely true. So I had to, one day during a work day, I had to get on my bike and I had to ride into the city, and I just ride my bike just right up to the gates of Government House. And the armed security guards at Government House just opened the gate. And I just rode into Government House on my bike. Picture me clip-clopping around, right, in my cycling cleats on the fancy floors of Government House, dressed in lycra. I kid you not. The only time I've ever been inside Government House and I'm clip-clopping around in lycra inside Government House. It's a true story. True story. But I often think about that story because that story was only made possible because the governor put me on a guest list. Right? Because the armed security guy at the gate was expecting me to roll up in lycra. You must be the guy, because no one else would ride up to the gates of Government House in lycra, open the gate and let me in. The governor made a way for me to be welcomed into his house. It had nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with him and his invitation. You ever been in that sort of place in your life? We're in part 3 of a series we're calling Greater Than. We're digging into this 2,000-year-old message, probably a sermon in a church, a little bit like this, that was preached into one of the very first churches, literally only 30 or 40 years after the resurrection of Jesus. It was a message that so resonated with that first church, that so kind of got that first church, that they copied it and sent it to other churches that were nearby and said, you guys have got to read this. You guys have got to teach this in your church. And it so impacted them that they made copies and so on and so on. And this first early church message got shared literally all over the world. And it became, as it got passed around, it became simply known as Hebrews, because the letter was originally preached in a Jewish church, and you'll see as we go along today, had all sorts of connections to the ancient Jewish, the ancient Hebrew faith. It's what we call the book of Hebrews in our Bibles today. We still have a copy of the same letter. It's a long message, it's a long sermon, but it has, as we've said each week, it has one main simple point to make, and that is that Jesus is the greatest of all time. Jesus, as we've said each week, Jesus is the GOAT, the greatest of all time. In part 1, we worked through the first couple of chapters. The preacher starts with a sort of summary of the overall message and where it's going. And in that first couple of chapters, he makes his first big point, which is that Jesus is greater than angels. And we talked about that, saying that Jesus is really greater than any spiritual being or spiritual power or force, not just angels, but any religion, any spiritual idea, any higher power that you can think of. The writer of Hebrews would say, whatever you can think of, Jesus is greater than that thing. Last week in part 2, we went through the next couple of chapters, chapters 3 and 4 of Hebrews, where the preacher made his second big point, that Jesus is greater than Moses. Now, you might not care much about Moses. I don't care much about Moses. But if you're a Jewish person 2,000 years ago, there was no bigger sort of spiritual guru, there was no bigger name in the spiritual world than Moses, right? 2,000 years ago, everyone knew the amazing story of Moses. God chose Moses, picked him out and said, you're the one that's going to free my nation, a whole nation, a couple of million people. You are going to free them from slavery in Egypt. And under Moses' leadership, Moses led the people out of Egypt into what he called for them the promised land. Well, he almost led them into the promised land because Moses promised them a land which would be a place of rest. We said last week, not a kind of feet up lazy kind of rest, but a kind of rest that is about peace and contentment and abundance and joy. That kind of rest, you have those moments, we said last week, those moments where you just go, in life. It's that kind of rest. Moses promised them that this land, what he called the promised land, would be that place of rest. But the people didn't stay true to God. They didn't follow God fully, and they never quite they got to the promised land, but they never got to that place of rest. And the writer of Hebrews says that in Jesus did what Moses never could do. Jesus' death and resurrection opens the door for all of us, for everyone, to enter a life of peace and contentment and abundance and joy. It opens the door for all of us, every person, to enter this idea of God's rest. Jesus made a way for us to enter God's rest, and that makes Jesus greater than Moses, because Jesus was able to do something that Moses wasn't able to do. So that brings us to part 3. And in this part, which is actually the major middle chunk of the book of Hebrews, the writer's going to make his biggest claim yet about who Jesus is. So kind of grab your Bibles and let's go. I say this every week. I'm going to say it again. The easiest way, there's paper Bibles at the back of the room. If you've got a device, the easiest way to find Moses in a paper Bible is to Hebrews, not Moses. Easiest way to find Moses is at the front. The easiest way to find Hebrews is at the back. Start from the back. There's Revelation, and then little books of John and little books of Peter, and then James, and then Hebrews. We're going to start halfway through chapter 4, which is where we sort of left off last week. I would say again, we're going to do the same thing that we've done each week. We're going to sort of skim through this week, kind of bounce through parts of the story, and then we're going to sort of circle back and try and draw it all together and make sense of it. I'll say the same thing that I've said each week. There's a lot of really complicated, for us, at least for us who don't know all of the ancient Jewish customs and things, it's going to be some really complicated, sort of weird stuff in this. But hang with me. I think when we sort of, if I can manage to draw this all together in a way that it makes sense, you'll see at the end, you'll go, it's actually really cool what the guy's trying to say, but it's a sort of complicated path to get there a little bit, okay? So let's go. We're starting it in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14. Today I'm in the NIV, the New International Version. So Hebrews 4:14. Therefore, he says, since we have such a great high priest who's ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith that we profess. Preacher says, hold firmly to your faith, because the reason to hold firmly, because Jesus is a great high priest. Jesus is a great high priest. This is actually a huge statement. It's the main point of where we're going today, the idea that Jesus is a priest and Jesus is a great high priest. But most of us miss how significant that statement is, because most of us don't understand what a priest is and what an ancient Jewish priest is. So let's kind of hit pause right at the beginning and explain what is a priest. In the time that Hebrews was written, priests were representatives of God. They were chosen by God to help connect people to God. And the time that Hebrews was written, people lived in a world where normal people couldn't get access to God. And so priests represented God to people, and priests represented people to God. If you wanted to know God, if you wanted to connect with God, if you wanted to get on God's good side, if you wanted something from God, if you wanted to ask something of God, you needed a priest to make that happen for you, right? And ever since the time of Moses, which for the listeners of Hebrews is like over 1,000 years before this message was preached. So for them, like for the last 1,000+ years, priests always came from the tribe of Levi. Now, some of you might remember this, but the whole Jewish nation came from one family. A father had 12 sons, and all of the Jewish people, so millions and millions of them, they could all sort of trace their family line to one of those 12 brothers, right? So if you were like if you were from the line of Judah, that means that you came from him and his family, or from Reuben or whatever. And one of the brothers was a guy called Levi, and his people were called the Levites because they were from Levi. And early on, way back in Moses' time, God had sort of chosen that one family and said, this family, not the other 11 tribes, this family, you guys will be the priests. That's kind of an important part of this whole story, because Jesus wasn't from the line of Levi. But the preacher wants to convince you that even though Jesus wasn't from the line of Levi, that Jesus could actually be a priest too. In fact, he wants to convince you not that Jesus could still be a priest even though he's not a Levite, that Jesus could be the greatest of all priests. Okay, so back to Hebrews. The preacher's going to start talking about priests. So jump to chapter 5, verse 1. He says, every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He's making the point that priests don't choose themselves, they get chosen. And especially the high priest doesn't choose himself, he gets chosen. Chapter 5, verse 5 says, in the same way, Christ didn't take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest. His point's pretty simple. He says, priests don't get chosen, right? You know that? Well, think about it. Jesus didn't choose himself either, right? God chooses the priests. And well, God chose Jesus, so maybe Jesus could be a priest because they're both chosen, right? It's his first little sort of argument there. Jump ahead to chapter 7. We're going to jump ahead a fair bit. And we're going to meet a guy called Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek, chapter 7, verse 1, Melchizedek was the king of Salem, and he was a priest of God Most High. Now, most of you have never heard of Melchizedek, and that's totally fine, because he appears just really briefly in Genesis chapter 14. It's like it's a cameo of cameos, right? This guy just appears for a couple of verses and disappears. Verse 3, the writer's talking about this Melchizedek guy, and he says, Melchizedek was without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Now, remember I said that priests always had to come from the tribe of Levi? Well, this Melchizedek guy, he says he was without father or mother, without ancestors. In other words, we have no idea where this guy came from. He just appears in the story and disappears. He wasn't from the tribe of Levi, but he was a priest, right? The preacher's trying to make the point that there's a precedent here for people being priests without being Levites. Does that make sense? He's digging up this old guy from thousands of years ago, saying, well, there was this guy once, and he was a priest, and he wasn't a Levite. So it's possible, isn't it, that Jesus could be a priest and not be a Levite if he was a priest like Melchizedek. So jump to verse 15. If another priest like Melchizedek appears, one who's become a priest not on the basis of a regulation as to his ancestry, but on the basis of the power of an indestructible life. He says, just imagine if another priest like Melchizedek appeared. Not someone who was a priest just because they were born a Levite, like that's the kind of regulation of ancestry, that's that bit. He's saying, what if another priest appeared who was a priest not because of that, but they were a priest because they had the power of an indestructible life. In other words, they were someone who lived forever. Verse 18 is the really important bit for you and me who are not part of this whole story. Verse 18 says, the former regulation is set aside because it was weak and useless, for the law made nothing perfect. and a better hope is introduced by which we draw near to God. The preacher's whole point about Jesus being a priest is that the job of a priest, remember we said, is to give people access to God and to make people right with God. And he's saying the old way, which is what he's talking about when he says the former regulations in verse 18, the old way of getting access to God, he said, has been set aside. In other words, it's over, it's finished. That old way, that's all done. And he says a better hope is being introduced by which we draw near to God. He's saying there's a whole new way of drawing near to God that is being introduced, and it's way better than the old way. The preacher is trying to convince you that Jesus is a new priest. He's a different kind of priest, and he's bringing a different kind of way for people to get access to God. That's the point of this whole Jesus is a priest thing. Verse 23, now there have been many of those priests, since death prevented them from continuing in office. You tend to, stop doing the job when you die. But because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, he's able to save completely. He said all those old priests, there were lots of them, they came and they went because they lived and they died. But Jesus is a new kind of priest, and he's a new kind of priest that lives forever. Verse 26, such a high priest truly meets our needs. One who's holy, he's blameless, he's pure, he's set apart from sinners, he's exalted above the heavens. That's a reflection back to the whole Jesus is better than the angels thing, right? He's way up there. Unlike the other high priests, he doesn't need to offer sacrifices day after day for his own sin as well as for other people's sins. He sacrificed for their sins once and for all when he offered himself. He says, Jesus isn't like all of those priests that have been coming and going for the last 1,000 years or so. They had to keep offering sacrifices day by day because they themselves were sinful, right? So they had to offer a sacrifice for themselves to get themselves right with God before they could offer a sacrifice for you to try and get right. Oh, it was really complicated. But Jesus, he says, has this one-time sacrifice, which was himself. It's the cross, him dying on the cross. He sacrificed once, and it covered sin for all time. Jump way ahead to chapter 8, verse 6. But in fact, the ministry that Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is a mediator is superior to the old one. He says Jesus is the greatest because his sacrifice is better than the old one, and because the covenant that he brings into play is better than the old one. Now, covenant's another kind of Bible word. Covenant simply means, in this context, covenant means like a deal that happens between two people. Right? It's a kind of a legal term to say, it's kind of a handshake deal, a covenant to say, okay, if you do this, then I'll do that. That's what a covenant is. And he's saying that Jesus kind of makes a covenant, a sort of a new deal, a new way of people relating to God, right? Verse 13, by calling this covenant new, he's made the first one obsolete. And what is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear. He's saying Jesus has created a whole new way for people to relate with God. And the old way is now obsoleted and outdated. It's soon going to disappear. Just as a bit of an aside, have you ever read the Bible and had that wonder, why don't we sacrifice animals anymore like they used to? You ever thought about that? Yeah. Never seen a sheep in church, right? This is the reason right here. This is the point. This is why we don't sacrifice animals like they used to in the Old Testament. It's why we don't follow all of the other weird rules and things you read in the Old Testament and go, well, God said do this. It's why we don't do any of that anymore, because Jesus is a whole new kind of priest. He has a whole new kind of covenant, a whole new way of relating to God. He has a whole a far better way, a new and better way to solve the sin problem, a new and better way to give people access to God, and that whole old way is now obsolete and has disappeared. So, jump forward again, chapter 9, verse 1. Now the first covenant, again talking about the way things were in the Old Testament, the first covenant had regulations for worship and also an earthly sanctuary. He's saying, remember the old way? It had all those rules and regulations. And remember, it was always based around the temple. It was based around a physical building, somewhere you could actually go and see and touch. Verse 11. But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle. Tabernacle is kind of another word for temple, space where people meet God. He went through a greater and more perfect tabernacle that's not made by human hands. That is to say, it's not part of creation. It's not a place you can go. He didn't enter by the means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once and for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. They're saying Jesus didn't sacrifice animals at the physical temple, like a temple made by human hands. He sacrificed himself, and his sacrifice, it's like he's saying his sacrifice sort of happened in the heavenly realms, right? When he sacrificed himself, something sort of happened in the heavenly spaces. And so the redemption, so the kind of the freedom that he wins for us is in the heavenly realm. Does that make sense? Like if you sacrifice in the earthly, you win something in the earthly. If you sacrifice in the heavenly, then you win something in the heavenly, which is what we kind of call eternal life, right? Yeah. Jump ahead, chapter 10, verse 11. Kind of wraps up this part of the story by saying, day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties. Again and again, he offers the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when this high priest, talking about Jesus, but when this high priest had offered for all time one sacrifice for sin, he sat down at the right hand of God. When it says he sat down at the right hand of God, that's Bible language for kind of drop the mic, he sat down and said, ta-da, it's all finished, right? That's what that means. He sat down at the right hand of God. Verse 14, for by one sacrifice he's made perfect forever those who are being made holy. He's saying for the last 1,000 years, priests have been doing the same thing, offering the same sacrifice, because the sacrifices they're offering were only ever temporary. Right? You sacrificed today and it got you good with God today. God heard your prayers today. You're right with God today. But the next time you wanted to connect with God, you had to do the whole thing again. You had to start from scratch again and do a whole new sacrifice and hope that that was acceptable to God and that He would hear your prayer next weekend. He says, but Jesus is a whole different kind of priest. He's a far better kind of priest because His death and resurrection opens a different way for people to get access to God. He came with this once-off, once and for all sacrifice, which was Himself on the cross. And this gives all people, for all time, complete access to God. Now, if you're a Christian in the 21st century, you're supposed to think that's pretty cool. Because of what Jesus has done, because of His kind of priestly work, you have, for all time, complete access to God. But for lots of us, this whole priest thing, it still leaves us with one big question, which is the so what question. And to be honest, so what is a good question? Because let's be honest, most of us didn't walk in here this morning going, I really need a priest. Do you know what I mean? Most of us don't feel like we need a priest. And so me standing here and telling you that Jesus can be your priest is like a great big pile of so what and a great big load of I don't care. Do you know what I mean? This is because we live in a world where we feel like, and I stress the words feel like, we can take care of ourselves. If we're hungry, we go and buy food. There's a great big building near my house, has Woolworths written on the front of it, and it's full of food. It never runs out. I can go there anytime and there's food. If I'm sick, I can go to a doctor and they make me better most of the time. If someone threatens me, I ring the police and the threat goes away. This is not how people lived in Jesus' time. Actually, coincidentally, it's not how a lot of people still live in the world today. But it's certainly not how people lived in Jesus' time. If you lived in Jesus' time and it didn't rain, or it rained too much, the food that you were growing died. And when the food that you were growing died, you died. Seriously. In Jesus' time, if you got sick, you laid there and you hope you got better or you died. And by the way, you lived every day just hoping that it wasn't going to be the day that some army from a faraway land didn't ride over the hill and kill you and everyone you know. That stuff happened, right? So if you lived in Jesus' time, if you lived in the time when the writer of Hebrews wrote this, you knew that you need help just to survive every single day. 2,000 years ago, people relied on gods, whatever the gods that they thought would fix their problem. They relied on the gods for their everyday survival. And priests were the only ones who could give them access to those gods, right? So a priest was super important. But today we can live, if we choose to, we can live like we don't need a priest. We don't need someone to show us how to get to God. We can live as if God doesn't even exist. And most of us can still live happy and healthy. If the writer of Hebrews was standing here and heard this conversation, I think they'd say something like, what do you mean you don't need a priest? What do you mean you can do okay without God? What do you mean you can find your own way with God if you need to? Like, don't you know God is the source of all life? You're only here because God said yes. The sun only rose this morning because God gave it a nod, right? Every time you breathe in and oxygen fills your lungs, that's a gift from God. Don't you? He would say, like, don't you guys know that? How can you possibly live life as if you don't need the source of all life? He would say that makes no sense at all. If the writer of Hebrews were here, he would say, well, even with all the stuff you've got in the world around you, obviously everyone needs God. Obviously everyone needs God. The only question is, how are you going to get God's attention? Jesus is the best way to get over your sin and over your failure. He's the best way to get through your inadequacy in life. He's the best way for you to live your best life. Because Jesus can open a way for you and me to get to God, just like the governor opened a way for me to get into Government House. Jesus can open a way for you and me to get to God better than anyone else, better than any other system, better than any other person, better than anything can open a way for you to get to God. That's the point he's trying to make here. Jesus is the greatest priest. It's not about what he wears, it's not about his title, it's about what he does. Does that make sense? I think if the writer was Hebrews was here, he would say, Jesus is the way. You just have to decide if you want to get there. Right? Jesus is the way. You just have to decide if that's where you want to go. Because I guess the truth is, if we want to keep living like we don't need God, then everything I've said this morning and everything the writer of Hebrews is trying to convince you of is a bit like whatever, right? Yeah. If you don't need God, then someone telling you the best way to get to God is like, it's a roadmap to a place I don't want to go. Yeah. And I guess the truth is, if we think we can control our physical and mental lives fine without God, if we think we can create, if you're sitting here and you think, you know what, I'm doing a pretty good job of creating meaning and purpose for my life, I'm able to live perfectly well without God, then I guess the writer of Hebrews would say, well, I guess you should just keep doing that then. Kind of sorry for wasting your time. But if you think you're not just a random meeting of sperm and egg once upon a time, if you think there's more to life than what you can see and touch and feel, if you think there's parts of life that you can't control no matter how hard you try, if you know that you're messed up and you fail and, you know, the inside stuff that you don't tell anyone else, if you know that you can't live your best life on your own, if you have that sense that my best life always just seems to be a little bit out of reach, if you think there could be a better way for you to live than to just struggle on your own and maybe hope that you get somewhere good, then you have to decide how you're going to get there. And the point of this 2,000-year-old message is to convince you that Jesus is the best way for you to get there. That accepting what he's done for you and that living life following him is the best way for you to get there. The job of a priest is to connect people with God and to connect God with people. And the point of this part of the message is to say Jesus is simply the best priest, the best person at doing that there's ever been, right? If you want to get connected with God, if you want God to get connected with you, Jesus is the absolute best way to do that. Jesus can give you permanent forgiveness for your sin and your failure and the stuff that you've done, the stuff that you're doing, and the stuff that you haven't even dreamed that you're going to do, but you know that this time next year you're going to have a whole new list of failures, right? It's the beautiful thing about being human, isn't it? Jesus can open the way for you to get personal and direct access to God. Jesus can give you a kind of life. We said last week, Jesus himself describes it as an abundant life. That Jesus can give you a kind of abundant life that lasts forever. It's not just about the quality of the life you live here, but it's a life that will last even after you die into eternity. And Jesus can do this because Jesus is the greatest. Jesus is the greatest of all time. That's the good news of this middle part of Hebrews.